Hello everyone! Welcome back to Siddle's Podcats, or welcome to Siddle's Podcats, and welcome back to Scylla talking about queer books. This is a given on this channel, to be quite honest. However, this is a very specific series that I'm doing throughout Queer Month as much as I can, which is recommending different queer books based on certain genres and or maybe like smaller niche situations we have going on, because, and I've said this in previous videos, but I will say it again because it is ever so important, queer books are not a genre category. And so if you want to read queer books, you should start looking for queer books within the genres that you actually enjoy. Because that way, you might actually find queer books that you like. Surprises keep on happening. So for today, we're actually not going to dive into a specific genre, or, well, to be quite fair, a lot of these books are confined within very similar genre types. We are going to be diving into a specific creature that keeps on popping up in queer literature, especially right now, which I'm very happy about, and I am of course talking about vampires. Now there's a very long literary tradition that connects monsters, and specifically vampires, to queerness, which partially stems from the fact that monsters often portray the otherness, and queerness for a very long time was considered as the other, in as much of a negative sense of the word as you can possibly get. And vampires have this very unique ability of both, you know, giving their state to other beings, as in turning them into vampires, but you also have, and this is going to sound weird, but stick with me here, there's a lot of literature specifically on vampires talking about how their penetration of a man into another man, more often than not, can also very often be traced back to either homophobia or authors being actually queer, but not very much out about that. So please understand that I am exercising a lot of restraint by not putting Dracula into this video, because the subtext is very explicitly queer. However, it's only subtext, and you can enjoy Dracula without necessarily thinking that it's queer. I do recommend reading up on that, though, simply because it's a lot of fun. However, staying with the classics. Weird transition, but we're just gonna go with it. One classic that I will be talking about when it comes to vampires and queerness is, of course, Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. This actually came out before Dracula did, in case you didn't know that. And a lot of people speculate that this is actually what inspired Dracula. Now, whether or not this is true is entirely up to people's imagination at this point, because Bram Stoker is not around to ask anymore. However, it is established that Carmilla came out before Dracula did, and ironically enough, a lot of people consider Dracula to be the very start of this vampiric craze that happened in specifically a lot of Gothic fiction. Which, to a certain degree, is true, because Dracula very much brought the monster to the forefront for a lot of people, but Carmilla was actually the first, at least in this tradition of a genre, to emerge as vampiric creatures, so to say. And Carmilla, of course, follows Laura, who is the main character of this, who becomes friends with Carmilla very early on in the book, and I say friends with a very specific connotation here, because if you read Carmilla, you will wonder how on earth they got this published in 1876. It is so explicitly queer to a point where it is essentially impossible to read this book without understanding that Carmilla and Laura have a very homoerotic relationship with each other. I don't want to say too much for those lovely souls out there who have not yet read the book. I do highly recommend it. It comes with the whole trigger warning of being a book from the 1860s to 70s, so be aware of that. There is, in case of the Dracula story in this case, which also is unfortunately present in Carmilla, there is a very, let's just say, vampirism at the time was very much connected to anti-Ziganism and anti-Semitism to a point as well. This is present both in Carmilla as well as Dracula, which, again, I'm not showing in this video because I'm exercising restraint. However, you should still read it because it's fun if you haven't read it yet. It's actually a lot more hilarious than, you know, you might think coming from a very old dusty book like that. However, as I said, there is a warning of specifically anti-Ziganism and anti-Semitism in both books, as well as a lot of racism just sprinkled in for good measure, misogyny, because why not, actually restrained more or less in Carmilla, so that's really nice. But the very nice thing about Carmilla as well is that, as you can see, it is fairly short, actually. My edition, for example, has, let me see, 156 pages, which is pretty nice, I would say. Speaking of Carmilla, because the books I have on this list don't really necessarily have any kind of connection to one another that I could make abundantly clear, so we're just going to stick with Carmilla and Dracula, because we're going to be talking about some reimaginings, or just creatures in general appearing again in some book, because authors were inspired to do so. Sticking specifically with Carmilla, there's actually two books that come to mind that do something with the legend of Camilla, or at very least the character of Camilla. One of them very recently came out, and I actually quite enjoyed it, which is, and I unfortunately don't have it right now because I lent it to a friend, but I'm of course talking about An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. This is S.T. Gibson's second book, and unfortunately, we're going to be talking about her first book in just a second, but unfortunately her first book was so good that any book after that is going to fall into the shadow of it, which unfortunately also happened a bit with An Education in Malice. If you are expecting a full-on Camilla retelling, you are in the wrong place. So please do not have those expectations going into An Education in Malice, because you are probably going to ruin your reading experience. What An Education in Malice is about is it's essentially this dark academia-esque situation set between two students of the same study hall, both of whom grow increasingly interested and intrigued by a specific professor that they both have. There's a lot of slightly unhealthy situationships happening. Yes, there is a teacher-student, I hesitate to fully call it romance, but situationship happening pretty prominently in one POV, because the book is dual POV, one's from Camilla's side and one's from Laura's side. So if this is something that you don't want to read about, I recommend you skip An Education in Malice. However, I personally really enjoyed my time with it, because I personally think that S.T. Gibson has a wonderful writing style that is just very delicious. And if you like the dark academia vibes and you want to throw in some vampires for good measure, because why on earth not? Because, you know, why wouldn't we throw vampires into that? I highly recommend you check out An Education in Malice. Another book that has Camilla as an occurring character, actually, and this one I am very excited to be able to talk about, is Unholy with Eyes Like Wolves by Morgan Dante. I got to read an e-arc of this. It is, I do believe, currently only available as an ebook. I'm gonna correct myself in the description down below if I find out any other information. And it is set as a semi-historical fantasy book, essentially, because we follow Noemi, who becomes beholden to a character that you might know from historical events if you are at all interested in very renowned serial killers. Yes, you heard that right, because I am of course talking about Erzsébet Bathory, who was a Hungarian, I do believe duchess. I'm not entirely sure about the name of her role right now, who is rumored to have killed at least over 200 of her serfs, so people who served under her, and who did not have a lot of rights, specifically during the time that she was alive, which was around the 17th century, if I am correct. It is, to this day, not 100% clear if she actually did that, because that's what's true with a lot of history, but she is rumored to actually take baths in the blood of her dames, essentially, which of course earned her the name of a Hungarian vampire. Morgan Dante is a fantastic author in my opinion. I love their work very much, so I'm going to be gushing about that in like a little bit. But essentially what happens is we follow Noemi, who becomes beholden to Ursabeth Bathory and actually also falls in love with her. The book is very bloody in a lot of ways, good and bad. It is fantastic. As a trigger warning, there is talk and brief mentions of sexual assault on a woman. There's also, like I said, there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of gore, there's a lot of things you would typically connect with vampires, so be aware of that. And Camilla has some time to shine. Let's just say it like that. What I personally really enjoyed about this book is the relationships we have between Noemi and Ursabeth, particularly because in the political situation that they are, we obviously have Ursabeth as the one who is more powerful because, you know, she could be getting rid of Noemi and also ruin her life with just a single word. But things happen that turn this power dynamic somewhat on its head, while still regaining the devotion, I would say, that Noemi has for her master, who is Ursabeth. And I was personally a really big fan of that. I think Morgan did a fantastic job at portraying that specifically. So if you're looking for a very erotic, dark and gory, sapphic vampire situation, you might want to check out Unholy with Eyes Like Wolves. We're almost done with retellings, or things very clearly inspired by previous vampiric figures, but of course we first, before we move on to anything else, have to talk about the elephant in the room, the one book that a lot of people might actually know about because it might have accidentally kicked off this whole queer vampire craze that's currently going on. I love that for all of us. I am of course talking about A Dowry of Blood by none other than S.T. Gibson. This is a very dark and gritty retelling of the Dracula story. As I said, I exercised restraint. No one said I couldn't talk about retellings, though. So, the reason I am so fascinated with this book, partially is because if you were so lucky as to get the original self-published version, you have a gorgeous cover on your hands. We are not going to talk about how dirty they did this book when they republished it, but that's a different story for another day. But the reason this book is so fascinating to me is because, while yes, it definitely does talk about Dracula's story, to a certain degree, as is told by Bram Stoker in the original Dracula, however, it takes the perspective of his three brides. Now, Dracula's brides have been reimagined in a lot of movies, TV series, different books, because they are very shadowy, if not almost entirely unsubstantial figures in the original book. They only appear approximately 3 times, most of the times in the background, and once directly messing with Jonathan Harker, who is to visit at Graf Dracula's castle at the beginning of the book. After that, they pretty much vanish. There's no other substantial mention of them ever again. And so what S.T. Gibson has done is she has reimagined the entire story of what has happened to Dracula, and specifically how he might be as a character, while from the perspective of those 3 wives that don't really get a lot of time to shine in the original. The way she's done this is everything is told from the first bride's perspective, Magdalena, who was the first one to be turned by Dracula himself. And the entire story takes a very dark and sinister turn by imagining the relationship the brides have with Dracula to be that of 3 brides to a very abusive husband. So if you have had an abusive relationship, be aware that the book very, very distinctly characterizes this and talks about this. There's a lot of talk about domestic abuse, exacerbated because this is fantasy, these are vampires and there's no way they could die. However, I will give you a very small spoiler on the way. We have a fantastically wonderful ending. The entire thing is written almost as if we were reading Magdalena's diaries, which I personally think is also a fantastic idea. Also, why do I keep calling her Magdalena? Her name is Constanta. I am very sorry. Names are troubling. Constanta, that's her name. There we go. So the entire thing is told from Constanta's perspective, and it reads almost like her diary entries. And because of the way that some of this is formatted, it seems very obvious that sometimes she's just running out of thoughts that she has for something. Like, for example, on a very first page, this is on page 3, we have some words that are crossed out because she doesn't really know how to say what she was trying to say. The next page, aka the next entrance, is a single line. This doesn't happen too often, so like there's a lot of pages that are just completely full, like, you know, in any normal book, quote unquote, but I personally really liked these because they really gave you the impression that she was trying to tell this story to someone or something, whether it be a diary, another person, we don't really know, but it's what's made this book so compelling to me when I first read it. So, in case you hadn't noticed yet, I highly recommend you check out A Dowry of Blood because it is fantastic. Thank you. Alright, this is the very obvious retelling specifically of classic vampire literature out of the way. So now, we get to talk about everything else. Let's go... what do we go first with? Let's stay with fantastical vampiric stuff. That doesn't necessarily go too much into the direction of horror, because we also have a few entries over there. First and foremost, let's talk about a duology. Let's talk about Silver Under Nightfall by Rin Chupeco. This is a Finnish duology. The second book came out this year, and I have finished it, and I really very much enjoyed it. The way that I usually try to pitch this to people is, have you watched Castlevania? And have you wanted the original triad to actually remain together and, you know, kiss on screen? If so, then Silver Under Nightfall might be for you. In this book, you follow Remy, who is a vampire hunter from a, you know, long history clan of vampire hunters, and he, you know, he tries to do his job. He tries to listen to his father every once in a while. His father is a piece of shit. You know, it is what it is. And at some point, he gets the, let's just say, somewhat dubious pleasure at first of meeting two vampires, both of which are, one of which is an heiress and the other one is a founder, I would actually say, of two respective vampire clans. Xiaodan, the heiress of the, I do believe, 4th vampiric clan that exists in the world that Remy inhabits, and Malik, who is the leader of the 3rd and most prolific and also weirdest clan, because they keep traveling around. They don't really seem to have a stronghold. I say seem to have because, spoiler alert, they kind of do, but no one is supposed to know about that. And Remy falls in with these two, who are both, I should add, fiancés, because something weird is going on in his country. The vampires that he keeps slaying keep coming back in worse ways imaginable. Even worse than, you know, actual vampires, which should be bad enough, but apparently is not everything, which he obviously thinks is fantastic. He hates everything about it. The thing I really enjoyed about this duology in particular is the characters and the relationships they have with each other. This is going to be like a tiny, tiny spoiler, but I do want to tell you why exactly I'm wrecking this to Castlevania. Every one of the 3 characters I just mentioned gets together at some point. The thing I loved about this book is how the relationships differ between the 3 people in this wonderful triad of 2 vampires and 1 vampire hunter. I love the relationship they have with each other. I love the way that they talk about specific traumata they have experienced and how they try to deal with them, both together as well as on their own. I love the fast-pacedness of this series, which is a surprise to me as well, because I usually am not the biggest fan of books that are inherently fast-paced, but these ones just got me. I think it is legitimately, if you like the characters of this duology, you're probably going to have a good time. There is, I would say, more politics in the second book, which is like a tiny little warning for those who are not necessarily the biggest fan of political fantasy. The first one is a lot more action-packed than the second one. It does, however, set up some of the political conflict, both within the vampiric clans as well as between the vampire clans and the humans, and I personally found it very intriguing to see where all of this ends up with. There's a lot of very ambiguous characters, both with the vampires as well as with the humans. It's never fully entirely sure whether or not the humans and the vampires are going to stick to their truce that they have made up of after they were able to kill one of the quote-unquote evil clans very much before the events of the first book. There's a lot going on in this duology, let's just say it like this, but the characters really got me. And I personally think we just need more books, first of all, with triads and just in general polyamory, because we love that. But second of all, there's just something about the age-old cliche of vampires versus vampire hunters coming together, having to solve a common issue, and then realizing, oh my god, I've actually started to care about the person that I have been hating my entire life because of the nature that we do not share. It just hits, you know? Unless the author completely ruins it, which is very rare, because this is like the best setup you could have for a slight enemies to lovers situation. It is fantastic. It's perfect. It's exactly what happens between Malik and Remy. I love it so much. So if any of what I said sounded interesting, maybe you should give Silver Under Nightfall a try. It's finished, which is another plus, I would say. So, you know, there's that. Speaking of series, however, one that is definitely not finished, let's talk about a fantastical, historical, planned 8-book series that just released its first one, and I am so happy that I get to hold a physical copy of it in my hands. Let's talk about The Fealty of Monsters. So this, first of all, is a stunning. I love this book to pieces. It's signed, because I'm special like that. I just, you know, There's a few illustrations in here, and I personally think we should just bring illustrations back because I love them, especially in fantasy books. But let's talk a little bit about what Fealty of Monsters is actually about. So the Fealty of Monsters is, as I said, a historical fantasy-esque setting during the Russian Empire, and we very specifically are going to be talking, probably, about the slight fall of the Russian Empire. Oops. We follow, mostly, Sasha Czarnolewski, who is a vampire and currently living in the Odonic Empire, which is predominantly made up of humans, and he is not necessarily supposed to tell anyone that he's a vampire, because vampires and humans are not exactly the bestest of friends. Which, to be fair, is understandable in a universe where vampires could potentially transform into horrific insectoid monsters. Which they do, and it's fabulous. I love it so much. However, Sasha is not just in the Odonic Empire, just living his life. He is the son of Władysław, who is currently very much close, I would say, to the Empire. Very specifically, the Emperor, and also very specifically, the Empress, just in a very different way. And Sasha is very much trying to keep his political position while also keeping his secret of being a vampire, while also potentially maybe stopping the Odonic Empire from attacking the free vampire states, because he would like to still have a home after all of this is over. There are 3 main POVs in this book. Sometimes there's a few shrinks to another direction. Most of them are from Sasha's POV, but we also have Uta, who is a human soldier, who has realized that if she becomes a soldier, she is not going to fulfill her dream of being fully and utterly besotted by the Emperor's daughter. So she does a quick change there, which is fair. I understand, you know, I personally, if Svetlana told me anything, I would just absolutely do it, and I personally think that I am right in doing that. And the third and last POV, which is also a human POV in this book, is Iwana, who is also a soldier like Uta and has actually grown up with her together, or well, trained with her together, and is on a very different path of trying to keep the Empire from falling apart, while maybe not always being entirely on the Emperor's side specifically. Because sometimes you need to keep the Empire together without looking at the figurehead. There's a lot of political intrigue in the first book already, and I cannot wait to see where the series is going. The author is also a wonderful human being, so I'm giving them a shout out as well, just in general. But if any of that sounded interesting to you, and also if you want to see Sasha being incredibly pathetic while also trying to keep himself, his father, and the Free Vampire States alive in an empire that does not care about vampires whatsoever, you should read this book immediately. He's so pathetic, and I love him so much, okay? This is very important to me. This is my last physical book that I have. We still have, I think, 2 more to go, so there's that. But, staying with the slight fantasy, maybe even a little bit steampunky vibes, let's talk about House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. First of all, very funny story. I read House of Hunger in the exact same month I read The House of Hunger, and I kept confusing the two of them because I didn't know which one had the article. Spoiler alert, it's not this one. So House of Hunger is a standalone fantasy book, which I personally think is also very nice. It is just under 300 pages in my edition, actually, and we follow Marion Shaw, who is currently living in poverty with her brother and trying to keep herself alive while working a very miserable job. However, she finds out, or well, not necessarily finds out, but she sees an advertisement for a blood maid, which is exactly as you think it is, and does exactly what you think it does. Applying for a blood maid, however, and agreeing to serving for approximately 10 years as one, would essentially save her life and also set her up for the rest of her life. She would earn a lot of money this way, and she can't really be picky in the situation that she's currently in. So she agrees, even though the part of the country that she's living in is very much against the practice of blood maids, because it's a very archaic practice, and also it sounds very bad. But, as I said, Marion does not have the luxury of choosing a lot in this book, in this case particularly because capitalism reigns supreme even in House of Hunger, and so she decides to join a house to become a blood maid for a baroness. Well, not baroness, countess, I do apologize. Her name is Lisabeth, and she is the countess of a very old house called the House of Hunger, where our dear Marion is supposed to become a blood maid in order to get things done. The one thing I will say that I found a bit worrying about this book is it is very short and is trying to accomplish a lot in that time, but I personally think Alexis Henderson did fantastic with the time that she was allotted, aka less than 300 pages, by trying to both introduce us to a very vibrant steampunk Victorian-esque world, giving us vampiric houses, essentially, battling for dominance, and also introducing us to both the practice of being a blood maid, as well as Marion herself, who is a fantastic main character, might I add. So even if I had some issues every once in a while with the pacing, I can still highly recommend this book, particularly because Marion herself is a fantastic character, and the wonderful gothic steampunk-esque vibes of this particular book are phenomenal. I really loved the way that Alexis Henderson essentially portrayed, you know, the relationship between vampires and their blood maids as something so uniquely different, as in, you know, just people essentially selling themselves to those vampires as blood banks, which I personally think is always a really interesting concept, but I think that Alexis Henderson absolutely nailed it in House of Hunger. This is not her first book, if I remember correctly. I do believe it is her second, and I fully intend on checking out her first book because I was absolutely captivated by this, and specifically her prose. So, there you go, another sapphic rendition of a vampiric, wonderfully bloody tale. Like I said, we have 2 more, and one of those is a a second offender. Welcome back, Morgan Dante, with King of Hell. This I have a very special relationship with King of Hell. I also got to read an e-arc of it, and it is very short. I do believe it is like 160, 170 pages roundabout. So as you can imagine, there's not that much that Morgan gets to have in order of setting the entire thing up. But what I really loved about King of Hell is the relationship specifically between the two main characters. King of Hell follows two perspectives. One is Laurencio, who is a vampire who has been killed by his former lover, who essentially hired a vampire hunter to get rid of him. It's a whole thing. He's not pleased about it. And because of his nature and everything that he's done, he is now confined to Hell itself. However, as I said, he's not exactly pleased with how he got there, and so his big plan is to make it big enough in Hell that he can get back up top and kill who is responsible for his death. As you do. And the second POV is the person he is beholden to, Paimon, who is one of the kings of Hell. And Paimon is one thing first and foremost, and that's bored. Paimon would like things to happen, and nothing happens in Hell that interests him in any way, shape, or form. So when he sees Laurencio, and specifically Laurencio's desire to have vengeance, he agrees. And so we begin a murder road trip with a demon and a vampire, which sounds like the start of a very weird joke. And that's honestly the vibe that we have with this. It's very bloody every once in a while, and there are some very intimate and almost really sad scenes, specifically when Laurencio gets to talk and think more about his past and what has happened to him. But the first and foremost vibe you have from this is unhinged road trip, but with murder. And I personally think that is fantastic. So if that sounds like a good time to you, you should really go check out King of Hell. And last but certainly not least, let's talk about the most horror-esque rendition, the most horror-esque moment of this entire video. Let's talk about Ossuary by T-Day Cloud. I have talked about T-Day Cloud before in this channel. I will continue to talk about her because her work is fantastic. But Ossuary specifically, so tasty. It was the first book I read by her, actually, and I do believe I would classify it more towards a novella, because I do believe it has like around 150 pages, give or take, I think. And Ossuary, at first glance, seems to not be exactly situated within the vampire tradition of queerness, but we get to that point fairly quickly. The essential story is that we follow Thiro, who is a witch, and he is from a family that specifies in breaking curses and or uttering them, which obviously does not give them a necessarily good vibe in the whole magical community. And he gets called to Scene to the catacombs of Paris, because there's a lot of curses down there, because of course there are. It's the catacomb of Paris. What else is supposed to be down there? No curses? Come on, don't be boring. But he gets called to the Scene, and he is supposed to start breaking the curses down there, because apparently, you know, some things have started to shake and awake themselves, and the magical community is none too pleased. He gets sent down there with a few colleagues of his, none of which actually really like him, because as I said, he and his family are not exactly chummy with the magical world. And of course, the second they enter the catacombs, things start to happen, and they are not good, and none of them are very pleased about them. What I love about Ossuary is just how incredibly horrific it is, in the best sense of the word. I was so scared sometimes reading this novella. It is a wonder how T-Day Cloud can use so few pages to build up such an immaculate, truly wonderful vision of the macabre that makes you feel for the characters and feel utterly terrified, even for the ones you've known for approximately 5 pages. I was incredibly pleased with this, and it definitely earned its spot on the list of short fiction that I'm actually a big fan of. The only reason I didn't talk about it in my short fiction video earlier is because it had so much to do with vampires, and I wanted to very specifically talk about vampire books in this video. So I kept it until now, which honestly think shows big restraint on my part once again. But if you like deep, dark, gloomy atmosphere, and if you want a short book so your TBR does not strain too much, I highly recommend you check out Ossuary, because I feel like you might just be able to find what you've been looking for. I do believe there's a lot of trigger warnings on the author's page. Specifically, I'm going to link that down below, so please do check those out. The ones I can personally think about right now is gore, blood, death, darkness, very, very narrow spaces that a character is trapped within, and the beginning of a truly toxic situationship that you can't even really call a relationship, because that's definitely not the direction that we're going in. So if that sounds interesting to you and or just does not turn you off whatsoever, go check it out. It is fantastic, and also the cover is beautiful, as you can see somewhere here, because that's where I will be putting it, probably. But yes, those were all the books I wanted to talk about when it comes to queer vampires. As I've said, vampires specifically have a very, very rich history of being combined with queerness, as do a lot of monster tales, but vampires do have so specifically. So there's a lot of vampire stories, especially those that are like a little bit older, that have very distinct queer vibes without being as explicitly queer as all of the titles on this list. So if you have any vampire titles that you would like to talk about in the comments down below, please do so. I'm also fully aware that there's more vampire titles coming out as I speak that I have not yet read that are also very queer, and sometimes even explicitly so. So I'm very excited to dive into those, and if you have any recommendations, again, the comment section is all yours, because we love vampires and we love queer books, and the combination of those two is truly sublime. So, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope some books on this list made you interested in picking them up. As always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience yourself. Maybe with some of these books, you know, you have a few to choose from. And I hope that you continue having a nice reading experience. And I will see you soon.